The introduction. The failure of the 1848 Industrial Revolution on social problems led to an artistic movement called Realism. At the turn of the century, art broke away from the objective representation of reality, creating a way for the avant-garde movement in the 20th century. Ang ibig sabihin nito, nung pagkatalo ng 1848 or nung pagkasawi ng Industrial Revolution and social problems, ay doon nagsimula yung movement ng realism or so-called as artistic movement or realism. It's like a century of it. So the evolution. So it starts from the Allegro in 19th in 20th century. So it consists a new era or the avant-garde, the movement in 20th century. The artistic patronage shifted increasingly to capitalize bourgeois and national academies, with a rising profile for art dealers and critics. The hub of Western artistic activity was in Paris. French Academy and Salon represented the establishment favoring neoclassicism and the beginning of the century at the later Romanticism. Social and political commentary appeared in the story paintings of Theodore Gercult and Francisco Goya, as well as the social realist works of Gustave Courbet and Honore Jamar. Ang ibig sabihin naman ng mga salitang ito ay dito na talaga yung nagsimula yung kabiasnan sa pagsusuri at pag-aaral ng arts composition, art basis. So, nagsimula ang mga iba't ibang konsepto ng pag-aaral sa arts basis na sinarin sa iba't ibang pag-aaral ng ibang bansa. So, sinimula ito sa bansang Paris, French Academy, and Salon. In that century, the first movement of art is also known as Neoclassicism, and after that it undergoing a Romanticism movement. The social and political movement are capitalized on four famous artists. These are Theodore Gercult, Francisco Goya, Gustave Courbet, and Honore Geomor. So sila talaga yung nagpapatunay na ang kanilang kasaysayan ay nandiyan talaga sa kanilang mga kakayahan sa pagguhit at pagpintas. Then the broad defense of the Salons was on the second half of the century by the provocative work by the likes of Eduardo Manet, the new styles of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, the birth of the concept of modernism and avant-garde. Photography became the means of documenting social realities and an art form accessible to non-elites. The architecture was characterized by new materials and techniques, the revival of classical and Gothic styles, arts and crafts movements, and Art Nouveau responded to the industrialization and mass production by emphasizing handmade crafts and organic forms. This information stated in this statement is also known as the major happened in 19th century. Classified that it will evolve probably. It evolved massively in the late 19th century by the new artists or famous artists like Edouard Manet, and the birth of the new arts forms and formation of classical and Gothic styles. So it represents some different arts forms as like crafts and sculptures and anything and so on.
And in art 19th century reflected social and political transformation of that time. In the west part of the world, social and technological upheavals spurred in the large part as a result of industrial revolution and correlating trends. Urbanization for living and working conditional durable expansion by emerging global superpowers. Neoclassicism, Western cultural movements in the decorative and visual arts, literature, theater, music, and architecture that drew inspiration from the arts and culture and classical antiquity. Example, Achilles lamenting the death of Patroclus by Havin Hamilton. Romanticism, a movement in the art of the literature and originated in the late 18th century, emphasizing inspiration, subjectivity, and primacy of the individual. Example, the 3rd of May of 1808, Francisco Jose de Goya y Lucientes.
Realism. Realism in arts means the accurate, detailed, and embellished depictions of nature of contemporary life. It rejects imaginative idealizations of favor of a close observation of outward appearances. The best example for this is the artwork of Gustave Courbet, Burial at Onans. Who is Gustave Courbet? Jean-Desire Gustave Courbet was a French painter who led the Realism movement in 19th century French painting. Courbet occupies an important place in 19th century French painting as an innovator and as an artist willing to make bold social statements through his work. What is the background of his artwork? The painting depicts the burial of Courbet's great uncle in the small French town of Ornans, and it is considered to be one of the turning points in French art. At 10 feet tall by 22 feet wide, the size of the canvas was typically reserved for religious or heroic scenes. Courbet also used the real people who had actually been at the burial, rather than the actors used as models for the art. It could also be easily called the burial of Romanticism. As Courbet himself said, the burial of Ornans was in reality the burial of Romanticism. Edouard Manet, a French modernist painter, one of the first painters to paint modern life in the 19th century, a pivotal figure between the transition of realism to modernism. One of his artwork is the A Bar at the Folies Bergerby. A Bar at the Folies Bergerby is a painting by Edouard Manet, considered to be his last major work. It was painted in 1882 and exhibited at the Paris Salon of that year. It depicts a scene in the Folies Bergerby nightclub in Paris. The painting was belonged to the composer Emmanuel Cabrier, a close friend of Manet. It is now in the Courtauld Gallery in London. Impressionism, a 19th century art movement characterized by a concern with depicting the visual impression of the moment, especially in terms of the shifting effect of light and color. The best example for this is the artwork of Paul Cézanne, A Boy in a Red Vest. But first, let us know who is Paul Cézanne. Paul Cézanne was a French artist and post-impressionist painter, whose work laid the foundation of the transition from the 19th century conception of artistic endeavor to a new and radically different world of art in the 20th century. What about his artwork? The Boy in the Red Vest, also known as The Boy in a Red Waistcoat, is a painting by Paul Cézanne, painted in 1889 or 1890. It is a fine example of Cézanne's skilled, nuanced, and innovative mature work after 1880.
Post-Impressionism. It is a predominantly French art movement that developed roughly between 1886 and 1905, which was from the last Impressionist exhibition up to the birth of Fauvism. The movement emerged as a reaction against Impressionism and its concern for the naturalistic depiction of light and color. An example of this is Pierre Bonnard's The Bath. Second, Modernism is both a philosophical movement and an art movement that arose from broad transformation in Western society during the late 19th and early 20th century. One of its examples is Edvard Munch's The Scream. Next, avant-garde. It is an unorthodox art style, a aesthetic innovation that still respects art, culture, and society. One of its examples is Pablo Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Then, now let's talk about art and craft movement. So, art and craft movement grew out of several related strands of thought during the mid 19th century. It was first and foremost a response to social changes initiated by the Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain and whose ill effects were first evident there. Next, Art Nouveau. It is an international art style, especially in architecture and applied art. It is characterized by asymmetrical shapes, extensive use of arcs and curved forms, curved glass, curving plant like embellishments, mosaics, and stained glasses. Thank you for listening. that concludes our topic about the art in 19th century. Thank you.